This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday. March 8th is International Women's Day, and actually the women I'm going to be speaking about today, women from history mostly, are all American women, but well-known American women. Today I'm wearing my AAUW t-shirt. That's American Association of University Women. My mother was quite active in AAUW, so you might say I'm a legacy, my interest in AAUW, of which I've been a life member since the late 1960s. And there is an international federation of university women because there are groups of university women in many countries abroad. When Bob and I were in England, we were in England several times, but I remember especially the year we were in Kew in England. That would have been in the 1980s. I happened to see the announcement of an London Federation of University Women meeting that was going to be held right in that area. So I showed up and said I was a visitor from the United States, and they welcomed me to come to their meetings while we were there for about 6 months in 1983, near Kew, which is southwest London. Basically, it's just outside the greater London area, but it has the important papers that my husband, Bob Whaley, was looking at in Kew. And we lived right near Kew Green and could go into Kew Gardens at any time. It's a beautiful park. And at the time that we visited, there were still some beautiful old huge trees, some that were 600 or 700 years old in Kew. And unfortunately, a couple of years later, there was a terrible cyclone or tornado kind of thing, which is very rare in England, but it did hit, and it hit Kew, and a number of those beautiful big old trees were taken down. Haven't been back there since the 1980s. When we were in Spain, I also looked up the Spanish Federation of University Women and went to a meeting or two of theirs. And that was such a long time ago, I don't really remember much of anything about it. But that is one of the wonderful things about AAUW, is that there are these international connections. And so that's why I thought I'd wear this particular shirt today. I was quite active in the Athens branch of AAUW and served as its president in the 1990s. Well, now let's take a look at some other women from history to celebrate Women's History Day, which is March 8th. And I'm using my book, which is Remember the Ladies by Kirsten Olson. And that's one of those very informative books that tells you about the people born on each day of the year, basically. So I think let's start with a group of two poets. First is Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath is someone who's almost exactly my age, because she was born in 1933. She was a famous poet, but she suffered during her lifetime on several occasions from mental health difficulties. And actually, she committed suicide in 1963 when she was only 30 years old. But her poetry is still quite well known, and enjoyed by people. She was married to a poet who is still with us, I think. His name was Hughes. But, and she had several children at the time that she committed suicide. She was living in London at the time, but she was an American, born in this country and going to college here. The next person, poet, that we would like to see is Edna St. Vincent Millay. Edna St. Vincent Millay was born in the late 19th century, and she was still around until into the 1960s. Her poetry is a great favorite of mine, but she was considered a very old-fashioned poet because she wrote in traditional style instead of the free verse, which became quite popular even in her younger days, in the 1920s and 30s and so on. But she wrote traditional poetry. She lived in New York State, and times when I have been visiting there and have driven up to Washington County, where my brother-in-law lived, I would pass by the little town village, practically, where Edna St. Vincent Millay lived for many years on the east side of the Hudson River. Edna St. Vincent Millay, the thing I remember about her best, about her poetry, which, as I say, was quite traditional, when her birth anniversary rolled around back in the 1990s, late 1990s, the U.S. Post Office put out a stamp featuring a beautiful picture of her. Not this particular one, but it did show her as a relatively young woman. She had red hair, green eyes, and she was famous from the time that she was quite a young girl, because in her teens she sent poetry to magazines, and a number of them were published when she was already in her teens. The poster that was put out by the U.S. Post Office has a quote from her, which I think is very appropriate, and it's the ending of one of her poems, which is one of my favorite poems. And the only problem is I sometimes get the two lines reversed, but it has to do with seizing the day, you might say, making sure that you do. You don't put off till tomorrow the things that you really should be doing today, and you don't put off till tomorrow or say, oh, well, I'll go see that great movie next week or whatever, and then never get to see it. Take the time to do something important. And one of the things you could do, although of course you won't be seeing Millay there, but tomorrow, when the International Women's Day is being celebrated at Ohio University, we will hear some great poetry from several women from Central America. And that is at 7 o'clock tomorrow night, March 8th, International Women's Day. Now, some other women that I'd like to talk about. There are two doctors, two very different women, but famous women doctors. One is Mary Walker. We have an interesting picture of her. There's Mary Walker. She's wearing a gentleman's hat, and she was born in the 1830s, and she served in the Civil War. She was one of the very earliest women doctors who had, actually gone to one of the first medical schools. And she served in the Civil War, and she was even given one of those famous medals, the Congressional Medal of Honor. She was given the Congressional Medal of Honor for having served in Kentucky and Tennessee during the American Civil War. And the interesting thing is that many years, she wore it every day. She was very proud of it. And one of the interesting things is that eventually what happened was that the U.S. Congress, government, decided that too many Congressional Medals of Honor had been handed out, and they started taking them back, canceling them, and hers was among them. She was not the only one she was the only woman who ever got a Congressional Medal of Honor back in the ancient days, but she continued to wear her Congressional Medal of Honor whether they had canceled it or not. And like I say, they weren't really picking on her because they canceled something like 900 Congressional Medals of Honor that had been given out during the Civil War, which seems kind of, I guess what they decided was the person who got the Medal of Honor had to have had as a particular place and, sort of a detailed account of what they had done in order to earn such a prestigious award. And so since they didn't have that detailed evidence on a lot of people, over 900, all men, they canceled those, and they also canceled hers. But Mary Walker was quite a person, and she started wearing men's clothing during the Civil War, and she decided it was much more comfortable than the hoop skirts and the bustles that women wore in the mid and late 19th century. So she just kept right on wearing men's clothing, and this does show her toward the end of her life. The other doctor that I'm going to talk about is Alice Hamilton. Alice Hamilton has some Ohio connections. She was also an early doctor, but certainly not as much of a pioneer as Mary Walker. But what Alice Hamilton did to maintain establish and maintain her reputation was that she became a specialist on industrial toxins, because it was beginning to be noticed that there were a lot of things that were really very dangerous for people to be working with, including lead. Lead is one of the worst that can pose a problem to the health of workers who have to work very much in lead. So Alice Hamilton became a specialist in toxic or poisonous things used in industry, and she was the person who was, because she was a specialist on it, she was the one who advertised the problems and helped treat the people who did suffer from toxicity from industrial poisons. Alice Hamilton. Now, the next ones that we're going to see are two famous feminists in different centuries. The first is Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony is sort of the premier, the premier feminist whom everyone knows. This shows her as a relatively young woman. She was a Quaker, later a Unitarian. She was from New England, born in Massachusetts and raised there. But she eventually, and also she lived in Connecticut, and she eventually moved to Rochester, New York. But she did a lot of traveling during the 19th century, speaking up for and writing about, but especially speaking up for women's rights. And not necessarily the right to vote that she promoted in her day, but in the 19th century, the laws were all set up in such a way that a man had to be responsible for a woman's property. So either a father of a woman or her brother or her husband would be in charge of her wealth, was entitled to take any wages she might earn, and so forth. And that was something that Susan B. Anthony thought was a very bad idea and very mean to women. So she spoke about it all over the country. And she came to Athens, Ohio. She spoke in Athens, Ohio, and in 1995, Judy Daso, who was in charge in the Alden Library of Archives and so on, promoted the idea of having a plaque put on Memorial Auditorium for Susan B. Anthony. Now, of course, Memorial Auditorium wasn't there in those days because she came in, I think it was 1879, if I'm not mistaken. And she spoke, but she did speak in a building that is still with us. I think it was built by then, which is namely City Hall. City Hall now has on its second floor a courtroom. But that courtroom was once an opera theater, actually. It was the only sort of large secular space in the city of Athens in the 19th century, the late 19th century. And so speakers who came to town often spoke there on the second floor of Athens City Hall. And that, we believe, is where Susan B. Anthony spoke on her visit. But as I say, in 1995, a plaque to the visit of Susan B. Anthony was installed on Memorial Auditorium, because that's where we have the plaques of the number of the famous people who have spoken at Ohio University. It was built in the 1920s. Memorial Auditorium was built on College Green in the 1920s. And since then, there have been a number of famous people who've spoken there. One of the other plaques for a woman is the one for Eleanor Roosevelt, because Eleanor Roosevelt did visit Athens at one point. I think it was when she was a delegate to the United Nations, which she was, you know, after the death of her husband, President Franklin Roosevelt, in 1945. And of course, I'm old enough to remember that time. I remember the day that we were called to the auditorium and told that the president had died. It was April 12th, I believe, 1945. Anyway, Mrs. Roosevelt, as I say, worked with the United Nations, which was really, she was named by President Truman to be on the group of Americans who represented the United States at the United Nations in New York City. You know, is the beautiful glass house by the East River, which I have visited. I've visited the United Nations under every Secretary General. including, I heard, the one who was before they built that beautiful glass building on 42nd Street, on First Avenue and 42nd Street. They were meeting out there where there's an airport today. And that was the first time that I visited the United Nations. It was in 1949 when I was a student at Stanford and went to New York City during the summer following in my freshman year at Stanford. So these are among the important people that we have. But I was originally talking, as you know, about famous feminists, starting with Susan B. Anthony. And the other one that I want to mention is Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan published a very important book back in 1963, which is still read and considered very basic to feminism and feminist theory. It was called The Feminine Mystique. And this shows Betty Friedan quite recently. She was a much younger woman back in the day when, in 1963, when The Feminine Mystique was published. But she has a February birthday. Her February birthday is February 4th. February 4th. Now let's see. Let's go on to some of the other women. Here's someone from the 12th of February, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. I believe we have a picture of her. Yes, there she is. Alice Roosevelt was her maiden name. She was the oldest child surviving of President Theodore Roosevelt, who became president, you know, in 1901 when the current president, who was actually an Ohioan, was assassinated. He was one of the victims of gun assassination in September of 1901. And his vice president, who had been sort of picked out by the Republicans because many of the traditional Republicans considered him so ornery, they thought, well, we'll hide him, we'll forget him by making him vice president, because usually vice presidents served and their names are not even hardly recorded because they never really did anything except serve as president of the Senate, which is their constitutional duty. Anyway, Theodore Roosevelt in 1901 became president of the United States, and his oldest daughter was Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She married a man named Longworth, who was later Speaker of the House of Representatives in Congress. And I'm wondering if she's wearing Alice blue, because there's an popular old song from the late 19th century called Alice Blue Gown, and she's certainly wearing blue in this picture. So that may very well be the color. I know it was a sort of a light blue color, and maybe that is her Alice blue gown that she's wearing there. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was still around until the 1960s, and she was famous for her sharp wit and sharp tongue. She was known for saying some rather stupid, well, not stupid, maybe actually they were very clever or mean things about people. She was famous for that, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Well, let's see. Who else do we have here who's has a birthday? I did already mention Susan B. Anthony, but I wanted to say at least one more thing about Susan B. Anthony, which has to do with my book here. Unfortunately, this book has for February 15th someone from ancient history, because they didn't know anybody who was born on February 15th. Now, somehow or other, Kirsten Olson didn't put Susan B. Anthony on February 15th, but all the books that I've seen, other books I've seen, I'm sure, gave her February 15th for her birthday, and in this book, she's given the 20th of February. I think that's just an error that was made by mistake. And let's take a look at the 3 women in the bathtub, because that also shows Susan B. Anthony. This marble statue, which I've shown quite recently, of course, is in the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on the ground floor now, or, well, it was on the ground floor in the lobby. Well, that's not exactly the ground floor, actually. If you've ever been to the Capitol, you know you have to walk up many steps to get into the lobby. Actually, I think it's maybe the 3rd floor, structurally speaking. So they had it up there for a while, but they decided it was an awfully heavy, big piece of marble, and it might be safer to put it down in the basement. At least I hope that's why they put it there, and not because someone, namely some male possibly, decided to exile the women to the basement. I think they did it for safety purposes. But that statue does show Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the left, who was a famous women's rights advocate in the 19th century. The woman in the middle is Susan B. Anthony, and the other woman is Lucretia Mott, because Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were the 2 women who actually celebrated the first women's rights. They planned and celebrated in northern New York, fairly close to Rochester, where Susan B. Anthony was living, the first women's rights conference in the United States. And that's at Seneca Falls, which is near the Lake Seneca, part of the 7 little lakes that go down from that are near the Erie Canal. So Susan B. Anthony was able to come over very quickly in 1848 in mid-July for this first women's rights meeting, which was planned by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And, I take it back. Actually, she wasn't there. Isn't that awful? It's too bad. But her parents were there, and they told her about it. And she got together and that's how she got together with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was also living fairly close by, but not in Rochester. She was living in a small town north of the Erie Canal at the time. So anyway, February 15th is the birth date for Susan B. Anthony, born in 1820. And she was still around until 1906. She was a little younger. She was about 6 years younger, 4 or 5, 6 years younger than Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was born in 1820, and Susan B. Anthony was born in 1826. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton died about 1902, which was the year that my mother was born, actually. And speaking of my mother, I want to show you not a picture of my mother, but I thought of my mother when I saw this picture, which is in my book here, and it shows a bunch of women, not women, bunch of men, you know, like about 14 men and one woman. And that one woman who's in the middle there, you see she's wearing a skirt, and there are all those fellows in their suits with their long pants on. She's there in the middle, and her claim to fame, she's a February birthday, and her claim to fame is that she was a famous woman pilot. Now, I don't know whether all those fellows are supposed to be pilots all dressed up in their good clothes, but that may be the case. Anyway, her name was Ruth Nichols. Ruth Nichols, and she was born in New York City in 1901 on February 23rd. And she was a person who set many records for women, you know, long distance flights, like New York to Los Angeles. Of course, in those days, when she was flying in the 30s, they didn't have jet planes, and they had to stop every once in a while and get some more gas. But she was a person who set a number of distance records for flying in the 1930s, mostly. For instance, it says here that in 1929, she entered the Women's Air Derby, which was the first cross-country air event for women pilots. But unfortunately, they had those planes that had the two wings. Remember, you've seen pictures of those. I think in 1929 she still was flying a biplane. Anyway, a gust of wind, if you can believe it, was so strong over Ohio that she had to land in Columbus. Now there's an Ohio connection for Ruth Nichols that I'll bet you never heard of before. You never heard of her, and you never heard that she was eliminated in Columbus, Ohio, when this side wind blew her into a tractor, i.e. a tractor. Obviously, she was blown right down out of the air but she survived that, and she went on to win a number of awards for long distance flying. Ruth Nichols, February 23rd, and born in 1901. It said she had 35 firsts for women in aviation. So she certainly was someone deserving of our memory and our time. Now let's see, who else do we have here that maybe we ought to speak about? Oh, well, here's Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson was born in 1902, which is just the next year. And actually, that was the same year my mother was born, 1902. My mother was born in Kansas, but Marian Anderson was born in Washington, D.C. Well, she was born in Pennsylvania, but probably her most famous thing that she's remembered for is the fact that the Daughters of the American Revolution, which is a women's group, my mother was quite active in the DAR out in Nevada. because she was, she could trace her ancestry back to a Stephen Ranney, who served in the American Revolution from Connecticut. But anyway, the DAR was, at the time in 1939, was not open to black people, black women, and they said that there was a scheduling problem and they couldn't let Marian Anderson sing on the date she was supposed to sing in Washington, D.C. at the big DAR beautiful building that they have with a nice auditorium and so on. And there was a big row about that. There was such a big row that Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the wife of the president, of course, resigned from the DAR because she was, her folks went back a long ways too, and she had an ancestor who had served in the American Revolution. She resigned from the DAR over that, and Marian Anderson sang at the Lincoln Memorial, if you can feature it. It was a big outdoor event, obviously, and she must have used a microphone and so on. And so I guess more people showed up than would have been able to get into the DAR auditorium. They showed up to hear Marian Anderson sing outdoors in 1939 at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. And of course, she was a wonderful contralto singer who actually had a good deal of training in Europe, and she did her first singing in Europe because she was a black woman in the 1930s. There just weren't that many people willing to sign up for her, I guess, in this country. But after she sang at the Lincoln Memorial, she had a lot more concert events. And I heard her sing in San Francisco, and that must have been in 1949. I think that was 1949. My college friend Naomi Grossberg and I went to San Francisco to the, I think it was the Opera House. It was one of the big auditoriums for music in San Francisco. And there we were in practically the top row of the balcony. We were way, 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 way up there in the balcony. We could just barely see Marian Anderson down on the stage, but we could hear her. Even they had such good acoustics there that even her beautiful pianissimo parts that she sang of songs came through very soft and sweet. Marian Anderson, who also sang at Ohio University, so there's a plaque to her at Memorial Auditorium too. Well, let's see, who else do we have here that we haven't spoken of? Here's Mary Lyon. Mary Lyon was the earliest woman in terms of birth dates that I've found for the month of February that I wanted to talk to you about. Mary Lyon was a pioneer in education, in women's education. Mary Lyon was born in 1797, and in 1835, she established the first women's college in the United States, which was, I guess it was 1837. Mount Holyoke, which is in New England and is a famous women's college. My daughter Alice applied to Mount Holyoke. Among other colleges she applied to when she was, well, it's almost 30 years ago now, more than 30 years ago now. And she was admitted, and a graduate of Mount Holyoke called us and asked to talk to Alice, and she was telling Alice, you know, all about Mount Holyoke and what a wonderful place it was, and I'm sure it was. However, Alice had also been admitted to Stanford, where I was well, I graduated from Stanford in 1951. So Alice went to Stanford instead, but she had a chance to go to Mount Holyoke, founded by Mary Lyon in 1837, and certainly a very well-known place. Well, let's see, who else do we have here? I think we have a picture of Gertrude Stein. Is there a Gertrude Stein there? There we go. Now, this is an interesting thing. This is not actually, as you can see, it's a painted portrait. And this is not exactly what she looked like, although it's very close to the photographs that we see. But this picture was painted by a famous 20th century artist, namely Pablo Picasso. Gertrude Stein was an American woman. She was born and raised in San Francisco in the West, but she went to college in the East, and eventually she moved to Paris. And when Gertrude Stein was in Paris, she had a famous salon, and people would come on a certain day of the week. She had that every day, every week. She had the same day she had a salon, and famous artists and musicians would come to Gertrude Stein's home and meet each other, you know. And so she was famous for her salon. And Pablo Picasso was one of the artists that she recognized early on, his talent and so forth. So that in 1906, I think it was, I mean, it was pretty early on, not too long after Gertrude Stein had moved to Paris, that he painted her. Pablo Picasso painted her, and I guess the clothes and the things in the background, the rug and all that sort of thing, were actually things of hers. But he wasn't satisfied with the face. And finally, he just painted this sort of mask-like face, which looks somewhat like Gertrude Stein really did look, but it is famous because of this fact that he didn't actually paint her face from life, so to speak. He painted a mask-like face, rather similar to Gertrude Stein, and it's one of his most famous portraits, Pablo Picasso's Gertrude Stein painting. Well, let's see, who else do we have here to talk about? Here's someone, we don't have a picture of this woman, but she's definitely a February birthday, and she's someone that I am very fond of. She was born in 1867, and she died in 1957. That's 90 years. She was a famous author of children's books named Laura Ingalls Wilder. Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote a series of books sort of based on her own childhood memories of growing up in what today we call the Midwest. In her day, it was almost the West period, although, of course, by 1867, California had already been a state since 1849, maybe it was 1850. And Nevada was a state by the 1860s, 1864, which is the state where I grew up. But Laura Ingalls, as she was, of course, born, lived in Iowa. She lived in South Dakota. Most of the Little House on the Prairie series is about South Dakota, but the Little House on the Prairie was actually just in Kansas. It was just barely over the line in Kansas or something, and what actually happened was when her father, Pa Ingalls, wanted to get some free land, 160 acres of free land, he by mistake was just over the line into Kansas, which was not eligible at that time, apparently, for that free homesteading. And so they had, but she was born there, and when she was still a baby, they moved away, and mostly they lived in South Dakota when she was young, and the on Silver Lake, for instance, Silver Lake was in South Dakota, and actually the place where she was born was just barely in Wisconsin, I believe. Actually, it was on the east bank, near the east bank of the Mississippi River, at a place where the Mississippi River is really a kind of a lake called Lake Pepin. And that's where the first place that she spoke about, that she wrote about, the Little House in the Big Woods. The Little House in the Big Woods was in Wisconsin, very close to the Mississippi River on the east bank. Well, I didn't read those books when they came out, although I was around. Her first book, the Little House in the Big Woods, was published in 1932, the year I was born. And all of her books were published by the early 1940s. She kept following the growing up of quote herself, Laura, as fictionalized in the books. She wrote the last of those actually in 1942 when I was 10 years old. But I didn't even hear of them when I was a little girl. I'm afraid they hadn't made it out to Nevada for some reason or other. And it was only when I was teaching that I discovered the books and recommended them to my students as very good pictures of pioneer life, because that was essentially, Pa Ingalls kept moving. I don't know what his problem was, but he would stay a year or two in a place, and then he would move on and take more land and build a new house, small, of course. On one case, they lived in a dugout on the banks of Plum Creek, and I think that might have been in Minnesota, on the banks of Plum Creek. There was he excavated in the side of the bank. I guess the water never actually got up into their house, but they lived in this dugout for several months while he was building an actual house across the stream, across Plum Creek. On the other bank, he was building a regular little house, and so that's one of the places that she lived. But she also lived on the shores of Silver Lake, which is the name of another book. That was in South Dakota. And later they lived in the nearby little town that sprung up when the railroad went through. You know, that was an important part of the settlement of the West, was when the railroads were invented and began to be built in all directions. The first transcontinental railroad was finished in, I believe, 1867, might have been 69, but that was, you know, they were building from the east toward the west, and they were building from the west toward the east, and they finally met in Promontory Point, Utah in 1869, and then there was a railroad all the way across the United States, and people didn't have to go, if they had the money and wanted to go fast, they could go across into various places west, including going through South Dakota, going through as far as San Francisco, or actually Oakland, because in the days when that railroad was built, there was no bridge. In fact, there was no bridge across the San Francisco Bay when I was a girl. When I visited San Francisco as a little girl in the 1930s, we had to take the ferry across from Oakland to San Francisco. But of course, now there's a beautiful big bridge, which actually has two levels on it, you know, one level for going and one level for coming, and meets in the middle in a little Treasure Island, I think they call it, in the middle of the San Francisco Bay. I remember seeing San Francisco Bay's little Treasure Island because they had but just barely remember it because it was 1939. I would have been 7, I think, or maybe 6. But they were having a World's Fair on Treasure Island in 1939. At the same time, they were having a World's Fair in New York City. And my husband, Bob, who of course grew up in Long Island, New York, went to the World's Fair many times. He had an aunt who took him a number of times to the World's Fair, and I think he went with his parents once too. Meanwhile, I got one trip to the Western World's Fair on Treasure Island, and I think the thing was, actually, I had just turned 7, and my mother was passing me off for 6, because at 6 you could just go under the turnstile and you could be free. And, well, she was passing me off for 6. I think I just barely turned 7. And I remember that aspect of it more than any other part of visiting the wonderful World's Fair on Treasure Island. It's odd, the things that children do remember, isn't it? But I loved San Francisco. We visited a friend of my mother's and father's, someone they had known in college, an artist called Squire Knowles. Squire Knowles drew with pencil a picture of me at age 9 when I was living in Nevada, and he happened to come up and to visit my mother. And I still have that picture in my house. It's a fairly large pencil portrait of me sitting in a chair in Fallon, Nevada, when I was a little girl, and we lived in a tiny house that was a pioneer leftover. It had 2 rooms and a huge closet off the kitchen, and a back porch that was screened, really nice. There was a big tree in the backyard where I had a swing and could swing when I was, like I say, I was about 8 or 9, I guess, at that time. in downtown Fallon, Nevada. And so here we are. We've been going through all these women who have birthdays in February. And I was just recently talking about Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote that wonderful series on pioneer life for women. And I think I've talked about every single one of them. I think I got every single one of them in. And I'm just getting notice that it's time to wrap up almost. March 8th, which is tomorrow, is International Women's Day, and they're having a big potluck at the Episcopal Church starting at 4:30, and lots of people are going over to hear the music of Las Vidas, the lives, sung by some Central American women and introduced by an American woman. So, happy International Women's Day, everybody. March 8th, remember the ladies. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.